Okay, welcome back. More Arthur Miller today. This time we're talking about an essay he wrote called Tragedy and the Common Man. It's a very short essay. And he wrote it about the same time, 1949, that he was writing Death of a Salesman. So clearly he has Willy Loman on the mind. And so he's going against an ancient tradition. And we read Aristotle's ideas about what a tragic hero must be. He must be of elevated status. He must have a tragic flaw of some sort. That brings him down. He must come from high level to low level, not because of vice or depravity, but because of some sort of a tragic flaw that brings him down. So Miller is writing against this background, and what he's trying to say is Aristotle was wrong, that if you and I enjoy tragedies, it's not because we enjoy watching kings fall, okay? That we enjoy tragedy because we can identify with the tragic hero to a certain degree. And therefore, you and I, because we are comparatively common people, we're not kings and queens, so you and I can identify with tragic heroes who are much more like us, again, according to Arthur Miller. So starting from the beginning, in this age, few tragedies are written. So he's saying, in 1949, people aren't writing a whole lot of tragedies. It has often been held that the lack is due to a paucity, a shortage of heroes among us, or else that modern man has had the blood drawn out of his organs of belief by the skepticism of science. Okay, so whatever it is that the heroic characters gave to us is that sort of the world of science is kind of removed. Okay, and the heroic attack on life cannot feed on an attitude of reserve and circumspection. We think too deeply. For one reason or another, we are often held to be below tragedy, or tragedy above us. The inevitable conclusion is, of course, that the tragic mode is archaic, fit only for the highly placed, the king or the kingly, and where this admission is not made in so many words, it is most often implied. So he's saying today, a lot of people believe that tragedy is too far above us, or we're below it, and it's archaic, and therefore it's only for the kings or kingly, and you and I can't identify. But his next sentence, I believe that the common man is as apt a subject for tragedy in its highest sense as kings were. So he's saying, no, the common man is a fit and apt subject for tragedy, as apt or as fit as any kings were. So that Willy Loman, he doesn't mention Willy Loman by name, but he's clearly got him on the brain, that Willy Loman is as apt a figure for tragedy as Oedipus was, even though Willy Loman is not a king. Okay, and then he's going to explain why that is. Let's turn the page. As a general rule, to which there may be exceptions unknown to me, I think the tragic feeling is evoked in us when we are in the presence of a character who is ready to lay down his life, if need be, to secure one thing, his sense of personal dignity. Okay, now think of Willy Loman. Okay, as a general rule, he's saying, Arthur Miller, the tragic feeling is evoked in us. We feel this tragic feeling when we are in the presence of a character, think Willy Loman, who is ready to lay down his life, if need be, to secure one thing. Okay, his sense of personal dignity. That's Willy Loman, isn't it? I think of Willy Loman's, the Loman family, as this house of cards, and Willy's image of himself as a great father, a great salesman, a great man, is something that people around him try to protect. And he has to live with lies that he tells himself and others, and delusions to maintain this house of cards. And so he has Linda who says, oh, no, you're a great father, you're a great person. He has Happy who is saying, Pop's got the best eye for color in the business, or we always told truth in this house. And then finally Biff, who's having troubles. We're watching him having a crisis in his life where he just doesn't want to be telling these lies anymore. Okay? But Willy has his own sense of self, his own sense of his personal dignity. And he would rather die than give that up. And in fact, he does. It would be hard to know what the next few days are going to be like if Willy doesn't kill himself, if he's around to wake up in the morning to have no job, no work, nothing to go to, no source of income. So I suppose in one sense, in an effort not to be around when that happens, he takes his own life, securing his sense of personal dignity. Let's go on. From Orestes to Hamlet, Medea to Macbeth, the underlying struggle is that of an individual attempting to gain his rightful position in his society. And I think he puts the word rightful in quotation marks because it's not objective rightful position. It is his sense of what his rightful position is. And again, think of Willy Loman. Willy Loman has an image of himself, and he is being threatened. That image is being threatened on all sides. And so we see him heroically combat threats to his image so that what he thinks is his rightful position, he gets to maintain this image of himself. Let's go on here. Sometimes he is one who has been displaced from it, sometimes one who seeks to attain it for the first time. So he's been in a position, his sense of himself, his rightful position, and he's been displaced from it. And sometimes it's a person trying to achieve it. But the fateful wound from which the inevitable event spiral is the wound of indignity, an attack of one's dignity, and its dominant force is indignation. Tragedy, then, is the consequence of a man's total compulsion to evaluate himself justly. Well, if he's going to put the word rightly or rightful in quotation marks, I would also put the word justly in quotation marks, because again, it's sort of this subjective justice, this subjective evaluating oneself justly. Not in an objective sense. And so the idea is that you and I, we each get to imagine for ourselves who and what we are. We try to maintain our image of ourselves justly. In the sense of having been initiated by the tragic hero himself, the tale always reveals what has been called his tragic flaw. Okay, so remember, the translation we had of the Poetics called this a miscalculation, but it could also very easily be sort of what we could call a character trait, a failing that is not peculiar to grand or elevated characters. Oedipus is not the only one who has a tragic flaw. Okay, many of us, perhaps we all do. Nor is it necessarily a weakness. The flaw or crack in the character is nothing and need be nothing but his inherent unwillingness to remain passive in the face of what he conceives to be a challenge to his dignity, his image of his rightful status. Let me unpack that because this is a key line. He's saying what the flaw might be, what the tragic flaw might be, is his inherent unwillingness, okay, his refusal. He is absolutely unwilling to remain passive in the face of what he conceives to be a challenge to his dignity. So when his dignity is challenged, he refuses to be passive. Okay, so the opposite of being passive is combating it. When his dignity is challenged, he fights it. When his image of his rightful status is challenged, he fights it. Only the passive, only those who accept their lot without active retaliation are flawless. Most of us are in that category, meaning most of us, when our sense of our rightful position is challenged, we buckle under the pressure. People tell us often enough, you suck. I guess eventually we're going to say, yeah, I guess I do suck. Willy Loman, everything in his life is telling him, you're not the person you think you are. You kind of suck in a lot of ways. But Willy will combat all of those threats and will deny them. And that's why the line when he says, I am not a dime a dozen, I am Willy Loman, when he says that, that actually means something to him. That's his burning calories to assert his image of himself, his rightful position. Okay, so skipping a couple of paragraphs down there to the second to last paragraph. The quality in such plays, in tragedies, that does shake us, however, derives from the underlying fear of being displaced. The disaster inherent in being torn away from our chosen image of what and who we are in this world. The inherent why we feel fear and we feel pity, okay, why we feel this catharsis derives from the fear that we all have of being displaced. This disaster we feel of being torn away from our chosen image of who and what we are. That's why it's so shocking to us oftentimes when somebody really tears into us and we are surprised that the rest of the world doesn't see us as the people we see ourselves as. Among us today, this fear is as strong and perhaps stronger than it ever was. In fact, it is the common man who knows this fear best. Okay, well, think about that for a minute. If that's really what the tragedy is that sort of that tragic fear from which our catharsis arises, our expulsion, our purgation of pity and fear. It's because we can identify with a person who is being threatened. His sense of himself, his rightful status, his position in the world is being threatened. And what he's adding, and it's the common man who knows that the best, knows that better than anyone else. You think you're important to your job. You've been working on this particular job for 30 years, and you think you've made a difference. And one day the boss comes in and says, oh, yeah, we're eliminating that particular wing. Here's your pink slip. We won't be needing you anymore. The boss isn't getting fired. It's the common man who gets fired. It's the common person, right? So we all know what that feeling is, that feeling of insecurity that we have in our sense of who we are in ourselves. And that, according to Arthur Miller, is why tragedy still is among us, and why we still need tragedies. We need plays, we need movies, we need tragedies in our lives, because we need to exorcise, we need to still feel that catharsis. Now think of Willy Loman for a moment, and think of him as a person who has maybe kind of a silly, a delusional idea of who he is as a man, as a father, as a provider, as a salesman, as just basically he believes himself to be a great man. I am Willy Loman, he says. He believes that means something. You and I might giggle in response to such an absurd assertion. But imagine being Willy Loman at this moment when this play starts. What are the threats to his sense of self? Well, his lack of success on the job. He's not doing well. He's not making it. He's not cutting it. And eventually he loses his job, doesn't he? So if part of how he imagines himself is as a great salesman, one of the threats is the reality that he's not, or the reality of losing his job. What's another threat to Willy's sense of self? Well, how about Biff's failure, as Willy understands what failure is? And Biff seems to feel like he's a failure as well. So Biff's failure is a threat to Willy's sense of himself as a great father, giving great advice. Maybe he gave Biff the wrong kind of advice. Or maybe when Biff recognized that Willy was cheating on his mom, that devastated Biff to such an extent that Biff realized the only thing I know about my own greatness is this hot air that you've been blowing me up with. Now I realize you're not such a great person yourself. We could also look at Bernard's success as a threat to Willy's sense of himself as a great father, right? He said, oh, Bernard, he can get all the greatest grades in school, but he's not going to make it as far as you guys will in the business world, because it's the way you present yourself that really matters. Well, Bernard grows up and he is very successful. So Bernard is a threat. I would also say that Willy's self-doubt is a threat to his sense of self. We get little moments where even when he says to Bernard, Bernard, what's the secret? I feel like maybe it's my fault. And then the minute that Bernard points out something that, maybe it kind of is your fault, Willy lashes out and combats that. So he has these moments of self-doubt. He asks his brother Ben, it says to him, maybe I'm not teaching him the right kind of things. Ben, how should I teach them? Okay, so obviously he has self-doubts. He says to Linda, people find me ridiculous. But anytime he has self-doubts, he knows that either his real support system, his wife, for example, or his imaginary, his brother's not imaginary, but his dead brother visiting him, are there to support him, okay, to combat this self-doubt. But to me, that's evidence that the self-doubt exists. And I'm sure that we could come up with other types of threat to Willy's sense of self. The walls are closing in. Or to mix my metaphors, that house of cards is getting pretty shaky. So what do we see Willy doing? Do we see Willy saying, I guess I'm not that great of a salesman? No, we see him saying, I've got a job, even after he's been fired. And he still believes he's a great salesman and he's going to knock him dead. He still believes in Biff's greatness, doesn't he? When Biff is asking at the end of the play, please set me free from your dream of me. Instead of saying, okay, yeah, you're right, I will. No, he still clings to this belief in Biff's future greatness. Because if he lets that go, then he's also going to have to let go of his belief that he was a great father. So anytime something comes along to threaten Willy, his sense of self, he combats it. And really, he has two go-to moves. He either lies to himself, and those lies, a lie he tells one moment, he'll contradict the next moment. In one moment, he'll say, Biff is a lazy bum. And then a few lines later, he'll say, one thing about Biff, he's not lazy. Or he'll tell Charlie, I've got a job. And then a few lines later, he'll say, can you believe it, Howard fired me? So truth for Willie is kind of squishy, isn't it? He will use a lie either to himself or to others or both at any time he needs to. And then his other go-to move, I would say, is delusion. He deludes himself. He escapes into this fantasy world of his own creation where he is a great man, that what his brother Ben was able to achieve is still achievable, that Biff has greatness in him and one day he will be great. And one day Biff will recognize what a great man Willie has been. My God, imagine how many people will show up to Willie's funeral. He's imagining that. And of course, just a few people show up at his funeral, just the family and Charlie and Bernard. So this makes, by Arthur Miller's definition, Willie Loman is a tragic hero. Think about it. Okay? Again, to read this line in the third paragraph on page 248. The flaw or crack in the character is really nothing, and need be nothing, but his inherent unwillingness to remain passive in the face of what he conceives to be a challenge to his dignity, his image of his rightful status. You may call his image of his rightful status fanciful, foolish, a lot of hard things, but it's also heroic in that he does everything he can, despite all of these threats, to maintain his sense of self, to keep it all from falling down, from collapsing. We could send him a lot of shoulds. We could say, well, Willie, you should take that job from Charlie, or you should let Biff go off and live his own life. And maybe in a reasonable, rational world, that would make sense. But that wouldn't make Willie a hero. It would make him the opposite. It would make him a person who gives up, who says, you're right, I'm wrong, and that means he's not the hero anymore. What makes Willie a tragic hero? Tragic, of course, because this leads him to his death and his lack of success in life. But what makes him heroic is he never, ever gives up. He never yields. And even in those moments of self-doubt, he convinces himself through lies and delusion that he is right. He is doing the right thing. He's been right about his own life. He's been right about himself as a great salesman. He's been right about himself as a great family man. He's been right about himself in Biff's future greatness. So again, we can call him a lot of hard names, but Arthur Miller said, don't forget to include hero. It may not be yours and my definition of what a hero is, but it is clearly a person who is surrounded on all sides and doesn't quit fighting. Okay, that's it for this section.